I was 8 years old the winter my father didn't come home. Our house sat on the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the gravel to fields. It was a modest place, a 2-bedroom ranch painted pale yellow, with white trim that had begun to peel in the cold. The coal dust from the mines always clung to everything, windowsills, the clothesline, even the snowbanks along the road. In our little corner of Pennsylvania, coal wasn't just a job. It was a heartbeat of the town. Fathers went down into the dark every morning, and mothers prayed them back up again every evening. That night, I remember my mother had made meatloaf, my father's favorite. The smell of onions and tomato sauce filled the kitchen. I sat at the table coloring in a worn Crayola book, my little sister Sally stacking blocks on the floor beside me. Outside, the sky had been dimming for an hour already. In December, the sun slipped away early, and the evenings belonged to the wind that howled around our eaves. Dad was supposed to be home by 5:30. He worked the day shift at the No. 9 mine, same as he had for 12 years. It was a dangerous job. Everyone knew it, but it was what paid for our house, our clothes, and the little extras, like the radio in the living room and the Christmas presents hidden in my mother's closet. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:05. He's just running late, Mom said when I asked. Her voice was calm, but she kept smoothing the tablecloth with her palm like she was trying to iron it flat. The TV in the corner was showing the news. Walter Cronkite's voice was steady, the way it always was. But I wasn't listening. I kept turning toward the window, half expecting to see Dad's truck pulling into the driveway. Sometimes, when he worked a little late, he'd bring home a chocolate bar from the gas station on Main Street. He'd hand it to me with a wink, as if it were a secret between us. By 6:30, the meatloaf was cooling. Mom lit a cigarette, even though she usually waited until after dinner. The smoke curled above her head, mixing with the smell of the food. Sally had fallen asleep on the floor. I tried not to fidget, but my stomach had that strange, heavy feeling, like when you know you've done something wrong, but can't remember what. Outside, headlights swept across the walls as neighbors drove past, heading home from work. I kept thinking, any moment now, any moment. But each minute that ticked by made the kitchen feel smaller, the air thicker. The phone rang once. Mom snatched it up before the second ring. "Yes," she said. Then, "Oh, yes, it's Helen." Her voice changed, tight, like she was holding her breath. She turned toward the corner, her back to me. She didn't say much, just listened. I saw her press her hand against the side of her neck. When she hung up, she forced a smile. "Nothing to worry about," she said, too quickly. "They just had a delay at the mine." But something in her eyes told me it wasn't nothing. By 7 o'clock, the streets were almost empty. The temperature had dropped, and frost was forming on the inside of the windows. Mom told me to take Sally to bed, but I didn't want to. I wanted to be there when Dad walked in. So I curled up on the couch instead, the scratchy plaid blanket pulled over my knees. I listened to Mom moving around the kitchen, her footsteps quick, restless. At 7:45, there was still no sign of him. I heard the back door open and close, the sound of boots on the porch, and my heart leapt. But it was only our neighbor, Mr. Carney. He stood there with his cap in his hands, speaking in a low voice I couldn't quite hear. Mom nodded, said something, and glanced toward me. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Carney gave me a small, strained smile before leaving. It was nearly 8 o'clock when I started to feel the first real pang of fear. Not the kind you get when you watch a scary movie or hear a thunderstorm, but the deep, cold kind that sits in your chest and doesn't go away. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and thought of the stories I'd overheard my father telling about cave-ins, gas leaks, equipment failures. He always told them to laugh, as if danger was just part of the day's work, nothing more. But now, those stories didn't seem funny. Mom sat in Dad's chair by the window, smoking another cigarette. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the clock. I could hear it ticking. Tick, 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 like a drumbeat counting down to something I didn't understand. And then, just as I was about to drift into a restless half-sleep, there was a knock at the door. A slow, deliberate knock that made my stomach twist. Mom stood, smoothed her skirt, and went to answer it. That was the moment the waiting stopped, and everything else began. When my mother opened the door, the cold swept in first, sharp and dry, curling around my bare feet like it had been waiting outside just for me. Two men stood on the porch, their shoulders hunched against the wind. I knew them both, Mr. Dawson, the mine foreman, and Sheriff Harlan. They weren't smiling, and they weren't taking off their hats, which already felt wrong. "Evening, Helen," Mr. Dawson said, his voice low. "Evening," Mom replied, her hand tightening around the edge of the door. "Is everything?" He glanced at the sheriff, who gave a slow shake of his head. "There's been an accident at number 9, Dawson said. "They're doing what they can. The day shift's still down there." For a moment, Mom didn't answer. The only sound was the wind rattling the gutter and the distant creak of the coal tipple at the mine. I was still on the couch, half hidden by the armrest, but I could see her knuckles turning white where she gripped the doorframe. "Was it a cave-in?" she asked. Dawson hesitated. "Gas leak. Explosion." That word, explosion, hung in the air, heavier than anything I'd ever heard. I didn't understand all the details then, but I knew gas was bad. Dad had told me once, in the kitchen after work, that methane could build up in the tunnels. If a spark hit it, just one spark, it could take a man's life before he even knew what happened. He'd said it in the same voice he used when explaining why we had to look both ways before crossing the street. Calm, but serious. "They're bringing the injured up now," the sheriff added. "They've got rescue crews working. But He stopped, looked down at the porch boards, and started again. "It's going to take time." Mom nodded, her face pale, but her voice stayed steady. "Thank you for coming." The men hesitated like they wanted to say more, but instead, they tipped their hats and left. She closed the door softly, as though slamming it might make everything worse. Then she just stood there, her hand still on the doorknob, staring at nothing. I slid off the couch and padded over to her. "Is Dad okay?" I asked. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Finally, she crouched down so we were eye to eye. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume mixed with cigarette smoke. They're trying to find him, sweetheart," she said. "He's strong. You know your daddy, he's a fighter." It was the first time I realized that strong people could still be in danger. The next hour stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Mom called my Aunt Mary, who lived 2 streets over, and within 10 minutes, she was at our door, bundled in a thick coat and carrying a thermos of coffee. They spoke in the kitchen, their voices low, but every so often I caught words: rescue, blast, unconfirmed. Sally woke up and wandered in, rubbing her eyes, and Aunt Mary scooped her up, whispering something that made her frown. Outside, the town was alive in a strange, quiet way. Every few minutes, a car would pass, heading toward the mine. Headlights cut through the dark like searchlights, but the engine sounded muffled, as if the night itself was listening. Around 9:15, there was another knock, faster this time. It was Mr. Carney again, with his teenage son. "They're bringing some of the men up," he said, glancing at me before lowering his voice. "But they're saying it's bad. A lot of folks hurt. Few didn't make it. Mom pressed her lips together, nodded, and thanked him. She didn't ask for names. Maybe she was afraid to hear one in particular. By 9:30, Aunt Mary was urging Mom to go to the mine, but Mom refused. If I go down there and see, and it's not him, she trailed off, shaking her head. I can't. Not yet. She kept looking toward the phone like it was a lifeline. The hours passed in pieces. A neighbor dropped off sandwiches no one touched. The TV stayed on but muted, showing images of the Vietnam War and winter storms in the Midwest. Tragedies far away, nothing like the one sitting at our doorstep. The clock ticked steadily, the sound almost cruel in its indifference. At 10:45, the phone rang again. Mom lunged for it, nearly knocking over her coffee. Yes, this is she. Her face drained of color as she listened. She nodded slowly, eyes flicking toward me once. I understand, she said, and hung up. What did they say? I asked, my voice shaking before I could stop it. They found some of the men from your daddy's section, she said. But not him. Not yet. Not yet. Those two words carried more weight than anything else that night. They meant hope, but they also meant the search wasn't over, and neither was the danger. Somewhere deep inside, I began to understand that not every story ended the way you wanted. It was close to midnight when the third knock came. Not the slow, careful kind from before. This one was heavier, more certain, like whoever was on the other side had no choice but to bring what they carried. Mom was in the kitchen, pacing between the sink and the counter, a cigarette burning down between her fingers. I was curled up on the couch, my knees pulled to my chest under the plaid blanket. Sally was upstairs, finally asleep. When the knock came, Mom froze. The ash on her cigarette had grown long and fragile, and it tumbled onto the linoleum as she turned toward the door. She didn't rush. She just walked, one step after another, like she was moving through deep water. Through the curtain on the door's window, I saw two shapes, Mr. Dawson again, and another man I didn't recognize at first. When the door opened, the cold came with them, along with a smell I'll never forget. Wet wool, cold dust, and something metallic that made my stomach turn. Evening, Helen, Dawson said, but his voice cracked on her name. The other man removed his cap. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, even in the cold. It took me a second to realize I knew him, Mr. Kelly, one of Dad's crew. He'd been at our house for barbecues in the summer, always laughing too loud, and eating an extra burger. Tonight, he wasn't laughing. They both stood there in silence for a moment, their boots leaving wet prints on the mat. Finally, Dawson spoke. Helen, we found him. Mom's hand went to her mouth. She didn't ask how or where. She just waited. He was in the south tunnel, Dawson said, eyes fixed on the floor. Didn't suffer. The blast, it was quick. There it was, the sentence that split my life into before and after. I remember thinking that didn't suffer was supposed to be some kind of kindness, but all I heard was gone. My chest felt hollow, like the air had been punched out of me. Mom nodded once. Not a sob, not a cry, just a small, rigid nod, like she was confirming something she'd known deep down since the first knock. Then her knees buckled. Dawson caught her before she hit the floor. I stayed frozen on the couch, watching it all happen like it was on TV. My mind couldn't wrap itself around the words. My father, who had carried me on his shoulders, who had taught me how to skip stones in the creek, who always kissed my forehead before bed, wasn't coming home. Ever. Mr. Kelly knelt in front of me. His face was gray under porch light, his eyes red. Kiddo, your dad was a good man, one of the best. His voice broke on the last word, and he stood quickly, turning away. The rest of the night blurred into fragments. Aunt Mary holding Mom at the kitchen table, both of them crying softly. Dawson leaving his cap on the counter because he forgot it in the heaviness of the moment. Me standing at the window, looking out into the dark toward the direction of the mine, wondering if Dad was still down there, under all that rock. Sometime after 2 a.m., the house grew quiet. The men had gone. Aunt Mary had made a bed for me on the couch, and the only sound was the wind outside. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tunnel as Dad had described it. Narrow, black, the walls sweating with water. I tried to imagine him there, but I couldn't. It was like my mind refused to let me see it. In the morning, the sun rose pale and weak, and the world looked exactly the same as it had the day before. That was the strangest part, that something so big could happen, and yet the sky didn't change. Mom moved like she was made of glass, careful not to break. She made coffee she didn't drink. Neighbors began stopping by, leaving casseroles and pies on the counter. They spoke in hushed voices, like the house itself had become sacred ground. I stayed in the living room, staring at Dad's chair by the window. The cushion still had the shape of his body in it. I thought, maybe if I sat there long enough, he'd walk in and tell me it was all a mistake. But he didn't. By that evening, word had spread through the whole town. The number 9 explosion had taken 6 men. The papers would call it an accident. The company would call it unavoidable. But to me, it was just a night my father didn't come home. And that night had only just begun to change everything. The days after my father's death felt like a dream that wouldn't end. Not the kind where you wake up in relief, but the kind where you open your eyes and realize you're still in it. The morning after the news, the house was filled with people. They came in waves, neighbors, family, men from the mine still in their work jackets. Some brought food, others just came to sit with us. The smell of coffee never left the air, and every surface seemed covered. Plates of sandwiches, pies, dishes of lasagna under foil. It was the way people here showed love. I suppose, feeding you when they couldn't fix you. I spent most of the time in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the rug, watching grown-ups speak in low voices. The men shook their heads often. The women held Mom's hands for long stretches. Nobody laughed. Even Sally, who was only 5, seemed to understand that loud voices didn't belong in our house anymore. The funeral was 3 days later. I remember the sky being a dull, heavy gray, as if even the sun didn't want to show up. The church smelled of wax and old hymn books. Dad's coffin sat at the front, closed. I didn't understand why they wouldn't let us see him one last time. Aunt Mary said it was better this way. I wasn't sure if she meant for him or for us. People lined up to speak to Mom, some crying, others struggling to find words. If there's anything you need, Helen, they'd begin, but most didn't finish the sentence. I shook so many hands I lost track, my small palms swallowed and rough, callous ones that smelled faintly of oil and earth. When the preacher spoke about how Dad was in a better place, I wanted to ask if that place was better than here with me and Sally, but I stayed quiet. At the cemetery, the cold cut through my coat, and the ground was hard underfoot. I watched the men lower the coffin slowly, the ropes creaking. A sharp wind blew, and I thought I heard the sound of the mine tipple in the distance. It felt like the earth itself was taking him back. Afterward, the house seemed quieter, though there were still people coming and going. Mom hardly slept. I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear her in the kitchen, the soft clink of her coffee cup, the whisper of a cigarette being lit. Sometimes Aunt Mary stayed over, but mostly it was just the 3 of us, me, Mom, and Sally, learning how to exist in the empty spaces Dad had left. His boots stayed by the door for weeks. At first, I thought Mom had left them there, because he might need them again somehow. Later, I realized she just couldn't bring herself to move them. His lunch pail sat on top of the refrigerator, still dented from years of use. I climbed up once when no one was looking, opened it, and found the metal thermos inside. It still smelled faintly of coffee. I closed it quickly, afraid the smell would fade if I breathed it in too long. Money became a topic I wasn't supposed to hear about, but did anyway. Mom took on extra hours at the diner and started cleaning houses on weekends. She looked older in those weeks, the lines around her eyes deeper, her shoulders carrying a weight I couldn't name. One afternoon, a man from a mining company came to the door with paperwork. He was polite, almost too polite, but his words were slick, like they'd been said 100 times before. "We're deeply sorry for your loss," he told Mom. "We'll be providing compensation." I didn't know what that meant then, but I remember Mom's jaw tightening, her voice flat when she thanked him. School was strange. My teacher, Mrs. Clark, gave me a hug the first day I came back, and my classmates were quiet around me. A few kids whispered when they thought I couldn't hear about the explosion, about how my dad had died, but no one asked me directly. I almost wish they would. At night, I started dreaming about him. Sometimes he'd be standing at the edge of our yard, still in his work clothes, waving at me. I'd run toward him, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't reach him. I'd wake up with my chest aching, my pillow damp. Mom told me once, maybe a month after the funeral, that grief was like learning to live with a missing piece. "It's not that you forget," she said quietly. "It's that you learn how to move without it." I didn't understand then. I thought I would never learn. The town went back to its routine eventually. The mine opened again. The tipple rattled in the wind. Trucks rumbled down Main Street with fresh loads of coal, and new men took the places of the ones who'd been lost. But in our house, time didn't move the same. Every day carried the echo of the one when everything changed. And though life went on, we were no longer the same people we'd been before the knock at the door. 50 years have passed since the night my father didn't come home. The number 9 mine closed long ago. The tipple was torn down, the tunnel sealed. Where the entrance once stood, there's just a chain-link fence and a weathered sign warning of unstable ground. Grass has grown over the spoil piles, though in summer, if you look closely, you can still see black streaks of cold dust in the dirt. I don't live in that town anymore. Life carried me away, to college, to a job in another state, to a family of my own. But the boy who sat on that couch under a plaid blanket, waiting for his father, never really left me. He's still there, in the back of my mind, watching the clock and listening for a truck that will never pull into the driveway. I became a teacher. Maybe it's because I wanted to give kids something steady, something safe, something I lost too soon. I tell my students about history, about how the past shapes us, but I never tell them about that winter night. That story belongs to me, and to the man whose name I carry. Every once in a while, when the air is cold and the wind whistles through the bare trees, I catch a smell that takes me right back. Coffee in a dented thermos, the faint tang of cold dust on a wool coat. I close my eyes and see him as he was the morning he left. Smiling, tired, lunch pail in hand, his cap tilted just so. I never knew it would be the last time. My mother lived another 30 years after Dad. She never remarried. She said once that some loves aren't meant to be replaced. She worked hard, raised Sally and me, and carried her grief like a folded letter in her pocket. Always there, even when you couldn't see it. Now I have grandchildren of my own. They know their great-grandfather's name, but they don't know the sound of his laugh or the way his eyes crinkled when he teased you. They've asked about him, and when they do, I tell them pieces. How he could fix anything with his hands, how he loved music on Sunday mornings, how he never let a promise go unkept. But I've never told them about the knock at the door. Someday I will. They should know. Because the lesson in that story isn't just about loss. It's about how fragile the world can be and how much love matters in the time we're given. People think grief fades. It doesn't. It changes shape, becomes part of you, like an old scar that aches when the weather turns. You learn to live with it, to smile with it, to build a life around it. But some nights, when the house is quiet and the clock ticks in the dark, I still hear that knock. And even after all these years, a part of me still gets up, hoping it's him,